Okay, everybody, might as well get going. This is our last class with a lecture, believe it or not. So, wow, 6 weeks have gone by pretty quickly. There's a lecture tonight that's going to be dealing with the Environmental Bill of Rights, toxic substances, and climate change. And that leads into our discussion on the YouTube. So we'll talk about that in a few minutes. So before we actually start the discussion, I just want to mention that, and everybody is aware of this, that the group presentations are on Thursday evening. So in 2 nights from now, everybody is to send to me your YouTube or MP4 or whatever mode of delivery you've put your presentation into. Send it to me by 5 o'clock tomorrow afternoon. I will then turn around. The way I plan on doing it is I'm going to embed them into a PowerPoint. And then at the beginning of class on Thursday, I will post the PowerPoint on CMS so everybody has access to it. We will watch the 5 presentations, all right? And at the same time, or at the end of the presentations, I will send everybody a Google form that has a series of 5 questions to be answered for each presentation by each of you. The way the scoring works, so that will generate a score of 25. So there will be the classmate score for each presentation, and there will be my score for each presentation, which have an equal weight. And I'll post those on Moodle, and those combined scores will give you the equivalent of 20% of your final grade. Okay, for the final exam schedule has been posted. So the final exam in this class is actually going to take place a week from right now. So Tuesday, July the 14th at 7 p.m. It's exactly as I described before. It's going to be 100 questions, multiple choice or true and false. So it's the same format as your midterm exam. It's going to be cumulative, which means that there's going to be some questions that dealt with the first 5 chapters that was covered to your midterm, and most of the questions dealing with chapter 6 to the end of the textbook. All right, I will give everybody 3 hours to complete it, so that should be plenty of time. And then what I'll do is I will release the scores for that the next morning. By that time as well, I will have already gone through all of your grades on CMS and taken the best 75% of your participation grades, which includes obviously tonight, and it will include a participation grade for you, basically giving me a survey response to the presentations on Thursday. So everybody gets a 10 out of 10 for providing a response on that Google form. Likewise, I will take the best 75% of your scores relative to the in-class, the breakout session questions. All right, so by the time we get to the final exam, you will know exactly where you are in the course, except for that one final piece, which is the final exam worth 20%. So does anybody have any questions whatsoever about that at this point? Everybody good for the group presentations and the final exam? Okay, again, if you have any questions whatsoever, please email them to me, and I'll answer you as quickly as I can. All right, guys, so let's go to the discussion on the video I provided for you yesterday. Oh, Shivani? Shivani, you had a question? Your hand's up? Everybody hear me okay?
I can.
Okay, good. So Shivani, did you have your hand up?
Oh, yes. I thought I unmuted it. So what was amusing about the video is seeing the glacier becoming so fragile and falling off into the ocean as a result of global warming. So I was surprised by that, basically.
Okay. All right. Anybody else? I mean, it was a really great video. I mean, I saved it to the end of the course because I really wanted you to watch it, because it is recognized as the most persuasive evidence of global warming on the planet. There isn't a scientist alive that deals with environmental matters that doesn't refer to that particular video, Chasing Ice, as the ultimate proof that in fact the planet is warming, and as you can see, the glaciers are retreating, right? And the other thing I should point out too, right? So we saw that the period of time that the filmmaker was recording with all those 25 cameras, Greenland, Norway, or Greenland, Denmark, Norway, I think it was, and Alaska, was 2.5 years, where we saw basically that the amount of ice that disappeared in the previous 100 years was equivalent to what had disappeared in a very short 5 to 10 year period. That was done in 2012, that particular video. So it's been 8 years since that's been done. So you can certainly imagine the further damage that's occurred. Kate, you had a comment?
Yeah, I was just shocked by like the 6 feet in 6 months. When he had went back 6 months later, there was already 6 feet gone. That shocked me.
Sure, absolutely. William?
Hello?
Yep, William.
Yeah, I'm just curious as to why we see like such empirical data like this, and we still have elected officials, not going to name names, I guess, that are in positions of power that are just climate change deniers when we have what's equivalent to a smoking gun.
There's lots of reasons why some people are climate deniers. Most of it are the politicians, Trump and Sean Hannity, which he was interviewed on that documentary, because they're playing to their political base. Their political base is fundamentally relatively uneducated white men, mostly in the south of the United States, who basically don't believe science. They don't believe science for any number of reasons. 40% of, and my apologies to anybody who may well be a fundamentalist Christian in this class, but 40% of the population of the United States are fundamentalist Christians who believe the planet is 6,000 years old, that God actually created it with Adam and Eve in Genesis 6,000 years ago. So they do not believe that the planet is any older than that. So it's not much of a stretch to understand that, if people believe that, we've only been here for, 6,000 years, the denying climate change is just an extension of that, right? So there you go. Tom, you had your hand up?
Hello?
Tom, go ahead.
Okay, I just wanted to say, like, from the video, it was surprising that most of the deniers are in denial because global warming climate change is not affecting them directly. So, I mean, like in countries like in Italy, I feel like there'll be more people who believe in climate change because it's affecting them more.
Well, and you were saying that because why? Italy has the Alps, the ice disappears in Italy. I mean, why did you choose Italy, Tom?
Because from the video, it's they pointed out in Italy, like I don't really know the exact wordings, but it's something like I think it's hotter, like they're experiencing more climate change there. I can't remember the other countries, but Italy was like the main one that came to mind.
Yeah, and that may well be a good point, but in the southern United States, certainly in the last 10 to 15 years, certainly with things like Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans, that kind of thing, the absolute magnitude of the weather incidents that take place, the weather disasters that take place, you would think it would be really hard, even if you live in the south of the United States, to deny that something is going on that it certainly hadn't gone on before. Okay, Michelle? Michelle, your hand's up?
Yeah, sorry, sir. Hi, sir. Yeah, I was really surprised to see how the temperature and carbon monoxide stayed almost consistently together up until industrialization, and then it went skyrocketing through the roof. And what I'm surprised about, with knowing these facts, that they still let big industry do what they're doing, and I don't think it's right. But what could we do about it?
Well, exactly.
Besides order submarines.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's obviously what we're going to talk about in tonight's class, what we can do about it and things like the Environmental Bill of Rights and what have you. But again, you know, and actually we'll talk about it when we get to climate change and the judiciability of actions for climate change. It is totally a function of politicians, right? Those people who we elect to make decisions on our behalf, we have a responsible democracy, not a representative one. And we all talked about that in the second or third class about the difference between the two. We elect these people to make decisions for us. And if we elect people like Trump and the GOP in the United States who follow him religiously, we're going to have a lot of problems with things like climate change because they have no political will to address it. They don't believe in it. And they have no desire whatsoever to address it because, in the game, it usually comes down to money. You know, anybody who is in manufacturing kind of thing doesn't want to address climate change because there needs to be, you know, what we do are caps, you know, caps on emissions and paying for it. And a lot of politicians don't want to do that because it affects their political base. Arette, your hand up.
Yeah.
Go for it.
I'll start by saying the beginning of the film struck me as to how they kind of show persons who are for and against the idea of climate change and the impact it's having. And I guess sometimes we get lost in the volume or the noise or perhaps what seems to be substance that the naysayers present and use science itself to support the claim that, hey, this is not real and this is a natural course of action that's just bound to happen. Doesn't matter what we do, it's going to happen. And there are persons who subscribe to those notions and believe it. Even person in high academia believe that. But like you mentioned just now, Maz, I think the issue of climate change and all that's happening, it gets tied up as to most government try to balance industrialization, economic growth versus saving the environment. Which one takes priority, which is more important? I think that's a struggle that's ongoing that government today still struggles to deal with. And I think those who accept it and understand that something is going on, it's almost impossible to find that balance between protecting the environment and keep the economy turning. We have to survive, we have to exist. And by surviving, we need food, we need industries to turn, we need trade, we need industries to work. And what we know about industries now, all our industries have some negative impact on the environment. And it's almost like they are stuck between a rock and a hard place. And we're asking them to do something with I don't know, juggling two evils, that to say, trying to find a balance in it. So I think that's where most of our leaders are.
Well, that's absolutely true. And we've talked about this throughout the whole course, all 6 weeks of it. In that it is a balancing act, and even in where we have things like environmental protection in place, environmental assessments in place, all those kind of things, it's never a position where, you know, those people who administer those statutes and regulations take the position that the environment has to be protected at all costs. It's not an all-cost proposition. There's always going to be some leeway to allow for economic activity, and so we will allow some toxins, we'll talk about this tonight, to actually go into the environment at the risk of shutting down a business altogether. So yeah, all right, you're absolutely right. The only problem, of course, with our main topic tonight, with climate change, is that it's such a great problem globally. That it's, you know, it's not like letting a small factory leach some toxins into the ground, the air, the water. This is the survival of the planet to a great degree if the glaciers disappear. But it's the same kind of argument, but on a much broader scale. Thanks, Red. Valerie?
That was actually my question.
Okay.
But thank you.
Okay, good enough. Tyler?
Yes, I think to some degree this has already been mentioned, but I'll just note that to me this is a direct reflection of the lack of regulations or the lack of enforcement of environmental regulations or legislation. And again, I think a matter such as this is just a reflection of that lack of regulations and legislation on environmental law.
Well, if that's what you take away from this course, then that's a good thing. All right. Anybody else have any comments or questions on this particular video, which I thought was a really good one? All right, your hand's back up again.
Yeah,
Okay.
as Tyler mentioned, lack of regulations and stuff. It will be like it's kind of hard to subscribe to that notion in the context of they don't care in one regard, because lack of more regulation in environmental law, meaning that there may be less regulation in that area. More regulation in one area may result in lack of regulation in the other area. It goes back to the balance, finding that balance, which is more important to a society. You find Canada is able to perhaps take more aggressive stance to environmental laws that would affect climate change versus China based on their agenda, their objectives, their society and belief and all that, right? So is it really regulation on its own, or perhaps that's driven by the demand of that state or economy?
Well, it's the same. It's a circle, right? Again, it goes back to regulations are put in place by politicians, and politicians are the ones that have to strike that balance between the climate and the economy. Lexine, your hand was up.
Yeah, definitely. I just wanted to say it's so surprising that a simple issue such as the climate, the temperature that we're experiencing can cost so much, such as they were saying that it costs, and well, it was an estimate, they're saying it's around $7 billion that will be needed to, like, I don't know, rebuild or refurbish or something after the storm or whatever. But I'm like, seriously? And then they were even saying like a statistics where they were saying the last 16 years at that time has been like the hottest. But I beg to differ. Compared to then, I know I think this is getting completely crazy. It's so hot compared to 2000 and whatever when that video was made.
Good, good. Thank you. Shivani, your hand is still up. Did you want to come back in, or is that just staying up?
I just wanted to ask, like, what are like the uses and the benefits of the glaciers?
I'm sorry, the benefit and uses of what?
The glaciers.
Glaciers? What are
Yeah.
their, well, I mean, the benefits, of course, well, that's a good question, really. I mean, it's a geological question to a great degree. I mean, I don't know what their benefits are per se, only because, you know, they're certainly just created as a function of the North and the South Poles being the way they are on our planet and their relationship to the sun and our rotation, so that they are supposed to be, or have been for a very long period of time, perpetually frozen. The only, you know, so there's no global benefit to that per se, except for those people who live in the Arctic, or and nobody lives in the subarctic really, but who live in the Arctic, like the Inuit who hunt and trap and live there and hunt seals and whales and what have you. But having said that, the problem is going to be with the loss of the glaciers. And you saw it really clearly in the video with the calving of the glaciers. It is really dramatic. But what's going to happen is that if the glacier ice keeps melting at the rate that it is, you know, what happens is ice becomes water in monumental scale of water, which is going to raise the level of the seas around the world. And it was actually mentioned in the video that by 2050, and that's not that far away, it's beyond my lifetime, but not yours, you know, maybe, you know, the sea level is going to raise 2 to 3 feet around the world, which means that, you know, vast amounts of our maritime provinces, Prince Edward Island will likely go underwater, vast amounts of New York, the island of Manhattan will go underwater, California, you know, San Diego, Los Angeles, San Francisco, a lot of that will go underwater. Vancouver will, a lot of it. So, you know, the whole point of the loss of the glaciers is that, you know, that it'll increase the entire level of the sea so high that the guess in the video was 150 million people who live in coastal areas on every country on the planet will have to move because their property is going to be submerged. So that's the disaster when we lose glaciers. Okay, Tyler, your hand is still up. You have anything else to say?
Yeah, it was from just from my point from earlier. I don't want to go too off track here. It's not entirely relevant to the video as much as it is to the whole course, but just to reiterate or rephrase what the notion that I had mentioned earlier as far as regulations and legislation on environmental law, is there may be a reasonable means of legislation and regulations regarding environmental law. I think what I was getting at was there is a lack of enforcement in environmental law and issues such as climate change or issues such as this one as we've seen in the video, due to what I would say is a bias of the courts. I'm not sure if this is what you were referring to when you were talking about a cycle of politicians and decision makers in such regulations and legislation.
I wasn't talking about courts, Tyler, but clearly the same. Clearly, what you're saying does apply to politicians. Valerie, your hand is still up. Did you have something else to say?
Yeah, I just had a quick question. Actually, you were talking about like the uses of the icebergs and everything like that, and the glaciers. And I know that there are some like water bottle companies associated with glacial water resources, and then they were showing the holes with that black gunk in. I forget what it was called, and I'm sorry. My brain doesn't operate after a certain time. But are there actually regulations to avoid that? Like, and then all of the stuff that's coming up from like our history, is that actually getting into the water? Like, where
Is your question, are the regulations with respect to the quality of water that is gathered?
that they're pulling from it, and does this also affect the glaciers themselves?
Well, two things. Probably the amount of water drawn from glaciers ostensibly wouldn't really affect them. They're so massive that it wouldn't reduce them to any negative degree. As to regulations as to the quality of water, there is very, very little regulations, and I'll tell you, and it totally depends on the country you're in. When I was practicing, I had a company by the name, I had a client by the name of Alpine Springs, and Alpine Springs was a water distribution company. So they, lovely name, Alpine Springs. They put water into, the same kind of bottled water, the 4 liter, whatever, 5 gallon water bottles that you buy in the store. Their source of water was a drilled well in the parking lot of their factory. So it just came from an aquifer, in that part of the country where they happen to bottle their water, and so there was zero regulation with respect to the quality of the water that they distributed, and there was clearly zero regulation with respect to what they could call themselves. You buy bottled water and it's named Alpine Springs. It could be named Glacier Springs. All of these things give rise to thoughts of, man, that must be really nice water, and zero regulation. So that was quite a while ago. That was probably 20 years ago, but I don't think it's changed a lot. Certainly nobody is regulating the names of companies. With respect to the content of water, maybe not. They may, certainly my experience in the water business is that, there are no inspectors that come around. There are no water inspectors that come around and test bottled water. The only water that's ever tested for the purposes of consumption is just like we saw in the Walkerton disaster a few weeks ago, where the brothers basically didn't ensure the water was treated, and so fecal matter killed 7 people in Walkerton, Ontario. That kind of water where it's being distributed through municipality, that is water that is tested. It has to be sent to labs. My experience is that bottled water doesn't. That may have changed in the last 20 years. I hope it has, but in my experience, I honestly couldn't say. All right. Any other questions, guys? Comments? Okay, that's great. Thank you again. Wonderful discussion. Before we go much further, I got to tell you, and I've said this before, I'm absolutely thrilled with the level of participation you guys have given me in this course. it strikes me as funny because, you know, quite often when I talk in front of a class, when I ask people to put their hands up and respond, it's sometimes difficult to get that to actually happen in class. But in this environment, this mode of delivery, you guys have been exceptional. So I want to thank you very much. All right, so let's, there's three things we're talking about tonight. Again, the Environmental Bill of Rights in Ontario, essentially, toxic substances. There wasn't any readings for this, so I'm just going through this with you for a PowerPoint, and climate change. And I gave you an article published for that purpose. So, all right, so let's do the Environmental Bill of Rights and Access to Information, which is the legislated purposes that we see with respect to how we address climate change and the environment, right? And what we're going to see, you know, what we're going to see in this particular part of the lecture is that there has been a growth of private citizens having the ability to be involved in environmental decision making, and we touched on this in a previous class, particularly with the command and control kind of things that are put in place with respect to getting licenses and permits for factories to be built or resource extraction companies to go into place. You know, more and more often there are public access to the kind of approval process, and so particularly with environmental approvals. So if you require an environmental approval, you know, for whatever it is, either under provincial legislation or federal legislation, there usually is going to be some kind of opportunity for the public to participate. And the reason this is really important is without this legislative kind of right in place, then the only participants in these kind of proceedings is A, the applicant who is looking to get a license or permit to do something that may have environmental impact, and B, the government agency that grants that license or permit, right? So that's almost always been the way the legislative structure has been until it has been updated to, in fact, allow what are called third parties, which is the public who don't, you know, have a personal, per se, interest in the license itself, but certainly have a personal interest in the impact that the license may have on the environment, right? The amount of public participation, it differs across the country from province to province, and it differs with respect to whatever sector may be involved. We've talked about what the sectors are, right? In the 1970s, a number of NGOs, non-governmental organizations or groups formed to deal with the environment and to basically lobby governments to allow for public participation. And your text has 4 or 5 listed of these kind of NGOs, but Greenpeace is like an NGO, right? These are the kind of organizations that they're non-governmental, as in they're not funded by the government, they're not an agency of the government. They are formed by, again, private citizens for the purposes of making a point in real terms. Originally, in the federal government's environment, there was an Environmental Bill of Rights proposed to increase public participation and on a federal basis. And indeed, part of that process was to see that in 1982, there would in fact be protection in the Charter, Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, to protect the environment. So, you know, as you guys already all know, the Charter, you know, has a number of rights and freedoms that are embedded in it. And these are constitutional rights and freedoms, so they're incredibly important. They override legislation, right? Basically, they are more important than statutes and regulations, right? So if it's something that's constitutionalized, it's incredibly important. Everything has to basically conform to that. So we, you know, again, the Charter has lots of rights and freedoms: the freedom for freedom of association, the freedom of speech, the freedom of assembly, the freedom to vote. We have rights like the right to life, liberty, security of the person, the right not to be detained arbitrarily, the right to remain silent, the right to be presumed innocent until proven guilty, that kind of thing. So that's the kind of framework within which the movement in the 80s, 70s, and 80s was to have a right to a clean environment for human safety, basically. But that didn't make it into the Charter. All right. Having said that, however, on the provincial side of things, there has been more success in seeing environmental rights protected. So Quebec was the first province to put in place an Environmental Quality Act and Charter, Environmental Quality Act, and separately in its Charter of Human Rights and Freedoms, which is the provincial equivalent to the federal Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. So Quebec was pretty enlightened in putting in a protection of environmental safety into both its Air Quality Act and its Charter of Human Rights. And Ontario created in 1993 an Environmental Bill of Rights, which is what we're going to talk about now. The 3 territories, so Northwest Territories, Nunavut, and Yukon Territory, they all have forms of enforceable environmental rights, all right, but not Charter of Rights. Territories don't have that right to have those. Okay, so in 1993, we have the EBR put in place, which provided the following ways to empower the public to take, to be active in environmental assessments and approvals. So we have what are called public participation rights, court access, whistleblower protection, and accountability. Right, so the EBR established new rights for public participation, which essentially means this, that the public as a whole is entitled to receive notice and comment on proposed statutes, regulations, policies, and instruments issued by the government that have an environmental impact. And that what really facilitates this is an environmental registry. So Ontario has an environmental registry which is kept current. So if you are in a particular area of the province and you want to make sure that you're up to date on what's happening in that part of the province environmentally with respect to new statutes or regulations or what have you, you just go to the registry and you can follow it from there. And if you see something that you have an interest in, then you have 30 days to basically make your interest known. There's also the right to request leave to appeal the approval of an instrument. An instrument is the granting of something. So the granting of a permit for a factory to be built, or the granting of a license to manufacture a certain substance, those kind of things. So if something is done and you're not happy with it, the permit's been issued, the license has been granted, then you have the right to request the opportunity to appeal it. Appeal the granting of those things. The difficulty with it is that it's only a request, for permission to appeal. It's not an actual right of appeal. So basically, what happens is that you will be given permission to proceed with an appeal if A, there is a good reason to believe the decision that's been made, i.e. granting that license or permit, is unreasonable, and importantly, B, does the decision, basically issuing that license or permit, result in significant harm to the environment? Right? That's a pretty tough threshold to get over. And of course, the onus of achieving that threshold is always on the people, the public, who are seeking the leave to appeal. There is a right to request a review of an existing law or instrument. Right, and so you can, if it's already been in place and for whatever reason it comes to your attention relatively recently, then you have the right to request a review of it. The review goes to the Ministry of the Environment. So you make that request and the ministry has the exclusive authority, or what's really called the total discretion, to either grant or deny the review. And the history of these things over the course of the last 20 odd years is that there's been more denials of review than granting those to in fact proceed with it. There is also a right to request an investigation into a potential violation of an environmental law. And again, whatever ministry is responsible for that law, and there's about 17 or 18 ministries in the Ontario government that do have some impact on the environment. Whatever ministry is involved, there is a right to request an investigation into that violation. But again, the minister for that particular ministry has the total discretion to deny that request. The EBR also expands the use of civil courts. We talked about that extensively in last class and the class before, to bring lawsuits to protect the environment. So what it basically does is two things. It creates a new statutory right to sue for what you believe to be harm to natural resources, right? So this is, if this statutory right didn't exist, then you would have had to seek a common law remedy. We talked about what those were in last class, particularly public nuisance, right? It's a strict liability regime, which again means that somebody who has caused harm to a natural resource, they're liable for that harm at the outset, but they have the opportunity to show that all due diligence was taken by the person who caused the harm to try to avoid that harm. And if they can prove that, in fact, the avoidance techniques that they undertook were sufficiently reasonable, then they will not be found liable. Again, the person seeking to sue for this statutory right has to show unreasonable behavior, not unlike the test we just talked about. And a court, with this particular statutory tort, really, they can issue an injunction, right? And a cleanup order, that's within the purview of this kind of regime, but not damages. So it's unlike common law torts in that regard. There's also less restrictive rules now around the common law action of public nuisance. So we talked about that a lot last day. So what that means in last day, the difference between private nuisance and public nuisance. So public nuisance was essentially something that took place that had an effect upon the public at large, and the government, whatever relevant government it was, the provincial or municipal for the most part, maybe federal, could bring action for public nuisance. This change in the EBR allows individuals to go after the public nuisance in addition to those governments I just named. The EBR allows for whistleblower protection, which simply means that those people who work in companies where the employees believe that the company has harmed the environment, the EBR allows them to blow the whistle on them, and in doing so, their jobs are protected. So that's a really good thing, obviously. So they're not going to be subject to dismissal or harassment to claims if they do that to their own employer, right? So it specifically protects employees to seek enforcement of environmental statutes, to give information to environmental agencies, or give evidence in enforcement or environmental proceedings. Okay, there are two accountability mechanisms with respect to the EBR, right? So the first one is there's a requirement for statements of environmental values that has to be produced on a regular annual basis by any ministries having to do with the environment. So again, those 18 or 20 ministries in Ontario that have to do with the environment, every year they have to produce these SEVs, right? And these SEVs have to be considered when the ministries are making environmental decisions, right? So that's a really important kind of thing. That's an accountability kind of thing, right? That in fact, decisions that you make have to take into account these values that you've already determined are important for the purposes of protecting the environment. The second mechanism, which has been watered down in the last couple of years, is the Office of the Environmental Commissioner of Ontario. That used to be pretty much an ombudsperson kind of position that would protect, it would give anybody who had a complaint regarding any ministry who you believe had harmed the environment to bring it to this ombudsperson who had the job of auditing the government's protection of the environment and reviewing implementation of the EBR and reporting to the legislature and the public on how the ministries were doing. That's a pretty important function. However, in 2018, the current Conservative government of Canada, Conservative government of Ontario, which was elected and took out of office the Liberal Party of Ontario, which had been in office for a very, very long period of time. The Conservatives took the position that this ESECO position would be eliminated and replaced with the Commissioner of the Environment, accountable to the Auditor General, which essentially means that the Environmental Commissioner who reported to the legislature in a very open fashion has been replaced by a Commissioner of the Environment who reports only to the Auditor General in a very private kind of nature, right? So it's totally taken the transparency of the process out of the light. All right, the second thing in addition to the EBR is the proliferation of access to information legislation in the last 20 to 30 years. Right, and the access to information is important with respect to trying to access information that will give rise to whatever complaint you may want to bring again, under the EBR or in an action for public nuisance or private nuisance for that matter, in any which way you want to bring an action. This gives you the ability to collect information, and information or knowledge is power. That's a very old saying. For comparison purposes, the text, we talk about what how disclosure is important in civil and criminal proceedings, right? Civil proceedings, other than this particular topic, where parties have to disclose everything they're going to rely upon at trial, right? Which means that if you have documents that you're going to rely upon, you have to give them to the other party. Each party is personally going to be subject to a cross-examination before trial. It's called a discovery, an oral discovery, and they have to give basically their evidence. The whole point of this kind of thing is that by the time you get to trial in the civil proceedings, there really shouldn't be any surprises, right? So it's not like TV and the movies where trials, there's always a surprise that changes the whole course of the outcome of the trial. That's pretty much the antithesis of the way it's supposed to work, and in fact, it does work. Likewise, for criminal proceedings, in this particular segment or sector, you have the absolute obligation of Crown Counsel to provide disclosure to an accused. That disclosure is a constitutional right under Section 7 of the Charter. The disclosure includes absolutely everything in the hands of the Crown, both evidence that is inculpatory and exculpatory. Anybody want to put their hand up and give a crack at what the difference is between inculpatory and exculpatory? I know some of you know this. Anybody? Okay. Inculpatory.
Sir, I could answer that, but I might be wrong. But one is towards guilt and one is away from guilt.
Okay, so which is it?
Inculpatory is from away from guilt.
Oh, I'm sorry. So what is it? What's your so inculpatory
is away from guilt.
Other way around, but good shot.
Oh, okay. Haven't heard it for a while.
Thank you, Shell. Good shot.
Thanks.
So yeah, so the Crown Counsel in a criminal proceeding, if they have any evidence that leads, towards guilt, right, that's inculpatory, they have to basically give that to the accused. If they have evidence that leads away from guilt, as in potentially towards innocence, that's exculpatory, out of culpability, right? Away from in. So there you go. So what the reason for this is just to give you some context as to the regimes that are already in place in the laws of this country that we basically rely upon the provision of knowledge to basically make justice more accessible and hopefully correct, right? So environmental statutes have been put in place basically that give some rights of residents to specific kinds of environmental information, but not extensively, certainly not to the extent that we just talked about in civil proceedings or certainly in criminal proceedings. So what we've had is the growth of access to information legislation, right? So you have the Federal Access to Information Act, and you have similar statutes in Alberta, British Columbia, and certainly in Ontario. The drawback to these statutes is that they have a long list of categories of exemptions, the kinds of information that will not be provided to you when you make an access to information request. And certainly they won't release any information relative to any personal employee information, relative to whatever ministry you may be complaining about. They won't provide any information that the minister deems to be confidential, provided by ministry counsel, as in solicitor-client privilege, that kind of thing. So these exemptions clearly limit the access to information that you would want to be seeking. So the Federal Act specifically exempts advice or recommendations developed by or for government. Again, that's very much the solicitor-client confidentiality. Confidential private business information, that's an interesting and a very broad exemption, because what that relates to is information on the company that has potentially caused the environmental harm to which you're trying to gather information. So they won't release information with respect to the operations of that company. That's a really big drawback, basically. Information relative to the economic interests of Canada as well is a category that's exempted, and that's a very broad one because, and again, we go back to the discussions that Orette and Tyler we had at the beginning of class. You know, this is where there is a very large gap that allows the economic considerations of a proposal to overtake the environmental concerns. Okay, so again, that's very much of a dichotomy that's difficult to achieve. All right, again, those are the statutes, provincial statute exemptions. We've already talked about those already. Okay, there is what's called a public interest override in this legislation, which basically says that the scope of those exemptions may be overridden where it is in the public interest to have that information, right? But remember, of course, that the person who makes the determination whether the exemption is going to be limited by this override is going to be the privacy commissioner, right? So again, that's a political appointment who exercises powers given to them by the government who has in fact hired them. So, you know, there's obviously, again, that may well give rise to political considerations. And again, the balancing act between the environment and economies, all right? The more specific exception to the exemptions in Ontario and BC is the exception that economic interest cannot be used to broaden the base of the exceptions with respect to the results of product or environmental testing. So the public interest, what that basically says is that the public interest overrides these exemptions and the expansion of these exemptions when it comes to actual scientific data that's been collected with respect to products and environmental testing. So you will get those kind of results with an access to information request, all right? And lastly, the Information and Privacy Commissioner, right? So again, information seekers, those who apply under the Act for information, who are unsuccessful can file complaints with an Information and Privacy Commissioner. So this is where this is kind of a quasi appeal process where this commissioner who has the right to overturn decisions of the privacy officials who you've made your application to, they can interpret the exemptions and the exceptions to the exemptions so that if they make them broader, then that will give information. If they make them narrower, then they won't. And depending upon the jurisdiction, the commissioner's recommendation may or may not be binding. Okay, all right, so that is the our discussion on the Environmental Bill of Rights in Ontario. So let's move into toxic substances. Anybody have any questions before we proceed to the next segment? Okay, again, I didn't give you any readings for this. So this, and again, obviously the matter I'm going to talk about is material for your exam. So it's not reading, but it is on the PowerPoint lectures. So, this is important. All right, and especially, obviously, as you can tell, toxic substances are incredibly important when it comes to the environment, right? So the subject of toxic substances provides the context for essentially a new regime of regulatory provisions, all right? And we know how important regulations are in this framework, right? So the concern with toxins focuses on substances that are, again, highly resistant to the natural process of degradation, which certainly means, or just simply means this: if a toxic substance is emitted, whether it's by a factory or some other process producing a product, whatever it may well be, if it is emitted into the air, water, and soil, and there is some difficulty with it actually breaking down and degrading so that it doesn't cause any environmental harm, then it's going to be considered to be a certain level of toxic substance. The first symbolic episode of an encounter with a chemical hazard was in a toxic blog in the St. Clair River in the 1980s. And that was where a factory, basically in St. Clair River out of Lake Erie, where in fact the toxins that were emitted from the factory accumulated and did not disperse in the river. right? And it became a substance all unto its own. And as a function of that, it became very clear that what the factory was doing was no longer going to be acceptable because its effluents were not degrading in the water, right? The Canadian Environmental Protection Act, we talked about this a couple of classes ago, includes several references to toxic substances, and here's what they are. These are classifications, but here's what the statute says. Whereas the Government of Canada acknowledges the need to virtually eliminate the most persistent and bioaccumulative toxic substances and the need to control and manage pollutants and wastes if the release into the environment cannot be prevented. All right, so this is the preamble. Whereas the Government of Canada is committed to implementing the precautionary principle, we all know what that is, where there are threats of serious or irreversible damage, lack of full scientific certainty shall not be, again, the precautionary principle, shall not be used as a reason for postponing cost-effective measures to prevent environmental degradation. Therefore, the Government of Canada recognizes that the risk of toxic substances in the environment is a matter of national concern and that toxic substances, once introduced into the environment, cannot always be contained within geographic boundaries. And so what the CEPA is saying in that is, again, the precautionary principle applies, which means action will be taken to protect the environment even before science has determined what action necessarily needs to take place or what substances need to be controlled. That's the precautionary principle. But what it's also saying is, look, the emission of substances into the air, land, or water doesn't respect boundaries, right? So, we don't necessarily, when we look back to sections 91 and 92 of the Constitution Act of 1867, dividing the powers between the feds and the provinces, we can't live by that relatively arbitrary boundary determined to be everything within a provincial boundary is a provincial concern, and things that cross provincial boundaries or international boundaries are federal. When it comes to effluents and dispersions of substances, right, these boundaries necessarily blur, and as a function of that, the CEPA may well have application. All right, a substance is inherently toxic according to the CEPA if it enters the environment in a quantity or concentration such that, one, it may have an immediate or long-term harmful effect on the environment or its biological diversity. Two, it may constitute a danger to the environment on which life depends, or it may constitute a danger in Canada to human life or health. Those are incredibly broad categories for application of the Act. Under the CPA, there are approximately 23,000 existing substances in use in Canada that are recorded on the domestic substances list. That particular list is a function of a regulation under the CPA, and as you guys already know, because it's a regulation, the list can be expanded upon very easily by the Minister of the Environment without resort to having to have it pass as a bill and into a statute. When a new substance is proposed for use in Canada, it undergoes an assessment pursuant to Section 77 of the CEPA, and the Minister of the Environment, following the assessment, can do the following. Can take no further action, which simply means that the assessment revealed that it was not going to rise to a category of toxicity to fall into one of the categories of protection, or it can add the substance to the priority substances list, which is really a watch list to say, you know what, this doesn't rise to the level of toxicity that we are going to do something about, but it's something to pay attention to. Or they can add it to the substance to the toxic substances list, which obviously brings into play all the other provisions of this statute. The Act, again, as a whole, recommends the virtual elimination in the case of persistent and bioaccumulative substances. So that is the goal of the CEPA, right? And it authorizes the minister to call for the preparation and implementation of pollution prevention plans, which may apply to a single substance or a group of substances. And as you can appreciate, when factories emit substances, it may not just be It may just not be, for instance, iodine or whatever goes into rivers that creates difficulties. It may be a group of substances that can be brought together as one targeted substance. And importantly, transportation of dangerous substances can be a significant issue due to the broad prospect of contamination. So we're now going to watch a video on a tremendous, and you guys may remember this, but you'd be pretty young. It was actually 7 years ago to today, a rail disaster in the town of Lac-Mégantic in Quebec, where a train that had gone through the town, and then for the purposes of the night had the brakes put on it outside of town on a hill. The brakes let go, and it rolled back into the town, and you'll see what happened in this video.
Lac-Mégantic, nestled in Quebec's eastern townships. Since it was built, this railroad has brought life to the close-knit community. But back in 2013, a ghost train rolled into town, and Lac-Mégantic would never be the same. July 5th was a typical sleepy Friday night, except at the Musique Café. Everyone knows someone here. It's the hot spot in a town of 6,000 souls. Karine Lafontaine, a 35-year-old mother of 3, is out for the night with friends and family. Just before 1 a.m., 10 kilometers uphill from Lac-Mégantic, a nightmare is set in motion. A parked train with no conductor, 72 tank cars long, carrying more than 7 million liters of volatile crude oil, starts rolling downhill. The brakes aren't properly set. The band finishes its set at 1:10 a.m. Geneviève Breton is out the door, heading home, but decides to go back into the bar to grab a bottle of water. The runaway train is now traveling 100 kilometers an hour. It jumps the tracks beside the Musique Café, igniting its crude cargo, turning the town into a sea of fire.
Oh mon Dieu! Oh my God! Oh my God!
We think around 50, and we know all the people there.
They're all gone, the people that was at the Musique Café.
There's no survivor. You survive or you burn. It was too fast. They were trapped there.
This is a story of unimaginable loss and the money men who came to town claiming they could make it right. July 6th, dawn comes and the fire is still raging after the tank cars derailed. The hot zone, too dangerous to approach. In the hours after the disaster, families were shell-shocked by what they'd seen.
Une demi-heure avant, j'étais là. J'avais laissé ma famille, là.
When Pascal Lafontaine heard the explosion, he heads back to the bar to search for his wife, Karine.
C'était à mon devoir d'aller rechercher la maman de mes enfants.
It's a desperate search. There are 3 children waiting for news at home.
Je l'ai fait en pleurant. Parce que, en voyant la catastrophe de l'intérieur, je savais très bien qu'il n'avait aucune chance de retrouver quelqu'un. Aucune.
Je me suis réveillée en sursaut, puis là, je me suis dit, Geneviève est pas là.
Hours after the explosion, Jeanette Cameron begins to panic, trying to contact her beloved daughter with the golden hair and the golden voice.
Puis je l'ai texté, téléphoné, appelé, texté, téléphoné, puis j'étais toujours sans réponse.
Fire crews from across the region are trying to get close, on the ground and from the air. But it's still too dangerous to even begin counting the missing and the dead.
J'ai été faire le pire travail, le pire... la chose la plus dure qu'une personne a à faire à dire. Je suis parti rejoindre mes enfants et leur annoncer qu'ils n'avaient plus de maman.
Everybody loved her. She was like un rayon de soleil.
Almost everyone in the bar that night died, including Geneviève Breton.
The worst part is we won't be able to see her. I will never be able to see that she's really gone.
By Monday, the small town is now overrun with people who've arrived looking for answers, including me, as I investigate the story for CBC News.
Just over my shoulder, you can see the lights there beyond the police lights. You can see those big spotlights that go. And of course, that's the process. They continue to look for the victims of the tragedy. Tomorrow, the chairman of the board is expected to arrive here. And there are many people who want a showdown with him as they try to get more answers to find out how this could happen.
It was a showdown indeed, as the chairman of the American Railway Company, Ed Burkhart from Chicago, steps in front of the cameras. Police had to protect Burkhart from angry townspeople.
Am I a compassionate person? I feel absolutely awful about this. I'm devastated by what's occurred in this community. We are making an abject apology to the people in this town.
Just to clarify, on the engineer, sir, are you saying it's the engineer's fault?
I'm saying that it seems that adequate handbrakes were not set on this train, and it was the engineer's responsibility to set them.
There will be lots of blame to go round in the months and years ahead, and clearly someone's going to have to pay for the loss of lives, homes, and businesses. And that's when the locals noticed some American lawyers who'd arrived in town that signed up the family of one victim to file suits seeking damages in the U.S. courts. And they wanted other families to know they were open for business.
We want to be able to present the opportunity to get fair compensation in American courts to the folks here in Quebec. And we think that we can maybe make up for some of the wrong that was done in Chicago by lending our services to the folks up here.
2 American law firms are joining forces to work on behalf of the families. As our colleagues from Radio-Canada's Enquête discovered, working behind the scenes is a Texan named Willie Garcia. He's not a lawyer. He signs up victims of disasters and refers them to law firms for a fee, a kind of ambulance chaser or what's called a case runner. It's now just 2 weeks since the disaster. Almost half the 47 victims' remains are still unidentifiable. Desperate families provide their loved ones' belongings to authorities, hoping to find a DNA match.
Écoutez, ça faisait quelques semaines que la tragédie est arrivée. On n'avait même pas nos corps. On n'avait pas nos corps.
Still grieving her fresh loss, Jeanette says she remembers getting a phone call from a lawyer's office inviting her to a meeting to discuss possible legal action. Inside a boardroom at a local hotel, those American lawyers are circulating contracts for the families of the victims to sign. By signing, they agree to pay the firms up to a 40% fee on any compensation check.
sont arrivés avec l'avocat québécois, avec des avocats américains qui ne parlaient pas français, qui sont arrivés avec le papier et voilà, vous signez. Voilà, vous signez, c'est là. Nous sommes là pour ça. Imaginez-vous, dans cet état d'émotion-là, vous arrivez à dire « Signe, t'es obligé de signer. » C'est là. Vous n'avez pas le choix.
Ginette is at the back of the packed room, keeping to herself when she's approached by a persuasive fellow with a hard sell. As Ginette recalls it, the man who convinces her to sign up for the lawsuit is Willie Garcia.
Il y a quelqu'un qui est venu me voir me disant « Madame, aimeriez-vous que la même chose arrive à une autre maman comme vous? » Alors, finalement, il m'a répété ça à plusieurs reprises. Qu'on nous, on nous demande là, d'entrer dans ce combat-là là, tout de suite. Là. Moi, je trouve que ça n'avait pas de bon sens quand je regarde ça. Ça fait longtemps que je l'ai réalisé, là, mais ça n'avait aucun bon sens là, que ça se passe comme ça. Là. Pourquoi l'urgence? Pour des sous? Je me disais que ma fille n'avait pas de prix.
Despite the concerns, the families of 40 of the 47 victims signed on. This is a good day for Garcia. Then again, he's an old pro, chasing clients and cash around the world. To some, he's the best case runner there is. To others, he's nothing but a crass profiteer.
That's what he told me, yes, all over the world. And he said, I get to the big ones.
Become a Fifth Estate Insider and keep up to date with the team you've trusted for more than 40 years. Sign up for the newsletter and get exclusive access to the Fifth Estate. You'll be the first to know about what the team is working on, upcoming stories, Fifth Estate news, and updates on past investigations. Go to cbc.ca/fifth to sign up and keep up to date with the Fifth Estate.
It was one of the worst rail disasters in Canadian history. 47 lives lost after a fiery derailment. Lac Mégantic's human tragedy making news around the world.
La policía ha recuperado ya 33 cadáveres.
Not long after the accident, a stranger appeared in town. His name? Willie Garcia. So, what's brought him to the disaster zone? Well, this is what he does. It's a long way from Lac Mégantic to McAllen, Texas, where Garcia lives and works. This is where Garcia has amassed a small fortune as a case runner. That's someone who finds clients for personal injury lawyers.
He is a very persuasive fella. He's got to be to do what he does, and most of these case runners are.
Bill Edwards is a longtime Texas lawyer who's crossed Garcia in court before. To him, case runners like Garcia are bottom feeders.
In my opinion, it's morally wrong because they are taking advantage of people who are impaired emotionally, terribly impaired.
Garcia got into the business of hustling clients around the time tragedy struck small-town Texas back.
All right, guys, I'm going to stop that there only because it's going now beyond the disaster in Lac Mégantic, but I wanted you to see that unbelievable disaster, and clearly one of Canada's most disastrous environmental contamination and explosions that we've ever had. Okay, so as a function of this, under the Transportation of Dangerous Goods Act, the following substances are heavily monitored for transportation, and keep this in mind for Lac Mégantic: explosives, compressed gas, flammable liquids, flammable solids, organic peroxides, poisonous and infectious substances, radioactives, and corrosives. Flammable solids are what would have been basically falling into that category for that train in Lac Mégantic. Right, so the Act provides for controls on the design and construction standards for containers. Again, think of trains, all right, and the whatever the trains build into They're containers for the transportation of goods, but obviously what they have to build into it for the safe transportation of those goods. The process requires the preparation and approval by the Ministry of the Environment with emergency response plans in the event of a spill, right? Okay, let's move on to PCBs. These are incredibly well-known toxins, right? They were, for the last part of the 20th century, PCBs were used, in a voracious fashion in the environment, right? They've been used for decades in industrial and commercial use. However, they were banned in Canada in 1980, so that's now 40 years ago. So and I remember this. So it's a long time ago now, basically. And under the Canadian Environmental Protection Act, we have now storage requirements designed to prevent the release of PCBs into the environment. Again, they're a toxin. The disposal of existing PCB stockpiles remains very troublesome, as in, even though they're highly regulated, it's very hard to control them. PCBs have entered landfill sites, right? And the problem with PCBs, so PCBs used to, come out of refrigerators and freezers and air conditioners and all kinds of equipment. PCBs were in it. They were part of the cooling agents for these kind of appliances. And these appliances, when they become junk, they're going into landfill sites, and the metal in the appliances breaks down, and the PCBs, leach into the landfill. And of course, what happens in landfill sites over the course of time is that the leach from those emanates out to surrounding lands, and sometimes waterways. Okay, so let's watch. This is a short history on PCBs.
Unlike any other substance, PCBs are the living proof of the fact that once chemicals are released, Unlike any other substance, PCBs are the living proof of the fact that once chemicals are released into the environment, they remain there for generations. When PCBs were first introduced in the 1920s, they were considered invaluable in electrical equipment, in buildings and in machinery. The chemicals are practically invisible and are not something ordinary people come in contact with. But a mere few generations later, PCBs had imperceptibly spread all over the world and are now to be found in both animal and human organisms, as well as in foodstuffs. When in the 1970s it first became evident that PCBs were a health hazard, they were banned by most of the developed countries. But it was too late, for PCBs don't simply disappear. On the contrary, they continue to do harm to this very day.
Now, in one lifespan, the future came rushing in like an avalanche. Here was power, unbelievably versatile power, titanically muscle power, leaping to any task, incredibly delicate power, responding with instant precision to the tiniest signal. With the birth of the electrical age, a nation's standard of living surged forward.
The prevalence of electricity has been a key factor in industrialization, so its use as an energy form in most types of products has, through time, skyrocketed. And a certain group of chemical substances, PCB for one, because of its being a kind of liquid electric insulation, has played a significant role in the distribution of electricity. PCB, first commercially manufactured in 1927, is a syrupy, sticky substance.
There definitely was the right time for this substance because we had learned how to generate electricity. We got the electric light bulb. We began to develop instruments and machines that needed electricity. Transformers, generators on telephone poles all across the country. As the electricity came in, they loaded those things with PCBs. And we wouldn't have nationwide distribution of electricity if it hadn't been for the PCBs.
After the introduction of PCB, it was found to have many useful properties for a wide range of products, not only for its resistance to thermal breakdown, but also because it could make other substances more pliable. Soon, the consumption of PCB quickly rose to several thousand tons.
They were used as hydraulic fluids. They were added to paints, to ceiling tiles, to linoleum. They were used in carbonless paper in the days before the word processor, and many, many domestic uses.
Basically, PCBs became that product that we introduced into practically everything where there was a possibility that this material would catch on fire. Any organic material is going to burn, but by putting PCBs into this organic material, it didn't flame up, it didn't burn, and it slowed down that process. They put it in the concrete, and then the materials that we're putting in our walls so our buildings wouldn't catch on fire. We've saved a lot of lives. We prevented a lot of fires because of the PCBs. They became very much a part of our lives.
In the 1940s and 50s, when the chemical industry was prospering, many new products, such as nylons, plastic containers, fire extinguishing agents and pesticides were launched, along with a number of chemicals which soon began to leave their mark on daily life. But by the early 60s, some of these new chemical substances were suspected of contaminating both nature and, perhaps, people. One such substance was the insecticide DDT, which had been dispersed over cities and fields since the 1940s in order to combat diseases and vermin, resulting later in traces of it being found not only in various species of birds, but also in agricultural products such as eggs, milk, butter, and meat. But when scientists began to trace DDT in humans, that wasn't all they found.
I got the task to analyze the Swedes for DDT and found, of course, DDT, but I did more than that because in the chromatograms that showed the DDT, there were 8 unknown peaks, each of them representing one substance, but we did not know what it was.
At Stockholm's Museum of Natural History, eagle feathers have been collected since 1888. When Søren Jensen began examining them, he found that from 1942 onward, there was a particular chemical which peaked, but which wasn't DDT. And when, after 2 years' research, Søren Jensen found excessively large concentrations of these chemicals in a dead white-tailed eagle, he managed to isolate and identify the unknown substances as being PCB and discovered them in some rather unexpected places.
Just for curiosity, I analyzed my own hair, my wife's hair, and all the kids. And it turned up that I had the highest level, my wife also very high. And among the children, the youngest, still breastfeeding, had the highest level of both PCB and DDT. I think that many societies got more or less a shock because in the past you have learned that DDT was spread onto the vegetation to fight against insects and so. But all knowledge about PCB was that it was used in closed system. And how could it come out then? Because half a year after the discovery, it was found all over the world.
PCBs had apparently leaked from machines, buildings, and electrical appliances into the environment. And as became evident, PCB, just like DDT, is accumulated in the food chain right from minute quantities in microorganisms and small herbivores to quantities millions of times higher at the top of the food chain, in carnivores and humans. It was, however, as yet still not widely acknowledged that PCBs were harmful to people. That is, until a serious food poisoning accident in a Japanese food factory in 1968 shed new light on the chemicals.
All right, guys. Okay, so we'll move from there into pesticides. So both insecticides and herbicides, you guys know the difference, obviously. Pesticides directed towards insects are insecticides, herbicides to plants are extensively used in commercial and domestic applications. They still certainly are. So in addition to human exposure with direct contact, the really insidious part of insecticides is that they end up being found residually in food and drinking water, all of which we ingest. Right? The Food and Drug Act, this is federal, provides mechanisms for monitoring pesticide residues in foods, and the guidelines for Canadian drinking water basically look towards acceptable residue levels, which means 0 is not the ultimate. 0 is a threshold that isn't necessarily always met. So they look for acceptable levels for pesticides that enter the water system through spills, aerial spraying, and runoff, which again accepts the proposition that there will be some residue distributed. The Federal Pest Control Products Act has a registration system for any substance or product used to control, destroy, attract, or repel a pest. So again, registration system is a function of regulations under the Act. There are hundreds of active chemical ingredients for pesticides registered in Canada. So you can again access this online. In order for an applicant to be approved to produce a new pesticide, and remember there's all kinds of businesses that do this. Monsanto does this, GE does this, right? Very, very large conglomerates produce these kind of products. Well, in Canada, in order to have a pesticide approved, it has to go through an environmental risk assessment. Right? This is obviously a good thing. And here's what the purpose of the assessments are. The health or environmental risks of a pest control products are acceptable if there is reasonable certainty that no harm to human health, future generations, or the environment will result from exposure to or use of the product, taking into account its conditions for proposed conditions of registration. All right. With respect to hazardous materials in the workplace, we have a system of information that's called WHMIS, W-H-M-I-S. It was put in place in 1988. Algoma University has a WHMIS system in place, right? It's a function of health and safety on the university campus, and the same applies across almost every business in the country. So what WHMIS does is it establishes procedures regarding the disclosure of information concerning the nature and management of hazardous substances in the workplace. So what happens is, and what's required under the Act, is that all workplaces have to post signs in what's supposed to be a prominent location in the workplace, basically identifying all the hazardous materials in that workplace and where they can be found in the workplace. So if for whatever reason you have an accident at work, no matter what kind of accident it is, and you think you may have come into contact with some kind of hazardous substance, you will know what that substance is by virtue of this posting in the workplace. For those who manufacture, process, package, import, or sell controlled products in the course of businesses, they are required to provide material safety data sheets and labels, right? So you see labels on packaging all the time dealing with products. So these packages are supposed to identify the chemical identity and concentration of any controlled product under legislation, right? And again, worker health and safety legislation authorizes employees to refuse to work, right? And this includes students on a university campus. You do not have to attend class, for instance, if you believe that there are dangerous conditions, which include the presence of environmental hazards, right? So that's an option you have coming to class. All right, and lastly, we'll watch this before we move into the final lecture on climate change.
There are quite a few different substances out there on planet Earth that might be beneficial to mankind in many different ways. When used in small amounts, some of these substances we're about to mention have positive or useful side effects. However, if you're exposed to a little bit too much, they can certainly be lethal. From pure rattlesnake venom to destructive metals, here are 13 most toxic substances on Earth. Number 13, asbestos. This cheap, insulating material was commonly used in houses until the shocking toxic effects were finally discovered. If you're living in an old home right now, it's very possible you could be breathing in asbestos and not even know about it. The only problem is that it's extremely deadly and can cause lung cancer after exposure. There's actually a city in Quebec, Canada named Asbestos where you can go and visit the actual mine. Many people don't believe the serious effects of this toxin and continue to use it despite its poisonous qualities. This photo here shows two young children completely covered in blue asbestos, which is the most toxic kind, at a playground in Australia. Unless you like rock minerals trapped in your lungs for decades, don't come near this stuff. This normally isn't poisonous right away, and it takes at least a few years until it develops into mesothelioma. Number 12, caffeine. You might be a little bit surprised by this, but you can actually overdose on caffeine. While your body probably won't allow you to OD on Starbucks coffee, you can definitely OD on caffeine. It's quite similar to overdosing on other stimulants such as cocaine. Ingesting too much caffeine can result in trouble breathing, confusion, hallucinations, vomiting, increased heart rate, and even death. However, most fatalities are from taking doses of caffeine pills well above the recommended dosage and would equate to at least 50 cups of coffee. In another case, it took 7 to 8 cans of an unnamed energy drink, which triggered a cardiac arrest. One Monster, for example, contains 480 milligrams of caffeine, well above the daily recommended dosage, which is only 400 by the way. So just be careful. Number 11, sarin. Sarin is a man-made nerve agent developed by Germans in 1938. What was supposed to be a pesticide turned into an extremely deadly gas. This causes muscles to twitch uncontrollably, triggering horrific pain throughout the body, and then eventually death by asphyxiation. Sarin has been used a number of times during wars, such as the Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s. Terrorists were able to get their hands on this stuff with shocking results too. The perpetrators released this neurotoxin in several subway lines in Tokyo. 12 died from this chemical, but about 1,000 were left with non-fatal injuries. Some have even accused Syria of using this deadly toxin recently in rebel provinces of the unstable country, which would be considered a war crime. Number 10, polonium. Possibly one of the most dangerous substances on the periodic table of elements is polonium. Polonium is quite strange because it's nearly invisible to all radiation detectors, and its radiation won't be able to penetrate a sheet of paper, which makes it possible to transport fairly easily. However, polonium will cause significant damage if only a little bit is inhaled or ingested. All it takes is 50 nanograms or inhaling 10 nanograms before suffering from severe radiation poisoning. In 2006, doctors in Russia were shocked to find out that a former officer of the KGB was administered 5 times the lethal amount in his tea. This was the first case of polonium poisoning ever recorded. It was concluded that this type of polonium had to have been made by a state-regulated nuclear program. Number 9, ricin. Ricin is one of the most deadly poisons in the world, and the side effects are just gruesome. Ricin is found in the castor oil plant and destroys your body's cell builders. The result from this substance, even if you survive, is severe damage to all your major organs. Just 1 milligram is enough to kill an adult if it's eaten or inhaled. This makes many countries curious about its possibilities as a chemical weapon. The gastrointestinal system is left destroyed, and vomiting of blood is noticed first. Let's just hope this chemical doesn't get into the wrong hands. Number 8, arsenic. Arsenic has been used as a sneaky way to poison someone for centuries, and certainly one of the most abundant toxic substances on Earth. It's considered to be an acute toxin, which means it can cause severe injury or a fatality as a result of a short-term high-level exposure. Arsenic can also be found at high concentrations in different types of soil, especially in areas where mining has occurred. In the modernized world, there's a very low risk of being exposed to arsenic, but in third world countries, many water sources can contain arsenic, which is then found in the fish too. High levels of arsenic will ultimately lead to multi-system organ failure, and your body will essentially be starved of energy. Number 7. Snake venom. What's kind of frightening about snake venom is that it's so toxic and it's naturally produced inside living organisms. Snakes like cobras or black mambas have some of the most potent venom in the world, and unlike much of this stuff we already mentioned, it only takes a few hours to take full effect. The snake venom is a mix of several hundred proteins and neurotoxins that attack the cardiovascular and nervous system. Different snakes have different venoms, which might cause different side effects, but statistics have shown that 1 out of 4 snake bites can be life-changing. The inland taipan is considered to be the most toxic land snake, and just 1 bite has enough venom to kill 100 people. Number 6. Tetrodotoxin. Tetrodotoxin is another toxic substance created by organisms, but mostly found in fish or aquatic animals. This includes species such as pufferfish, porcupine fish, ocean sunfish, and triggerfish, to name a few. This is one of the most horrifying substances you definitely don't want to come into contact with. The first symptoms occur within 15 minutes of ingestion. First, your body will reject the chemicals by vomiting and diarrhea. Then it slows down communication with the nervous system, leading to your face, lips, and tongue becoming completely numb. Motor paralysis will soon occur, which will lead to the inability to walk, and you'll be in a state of complete paralysis. Finally, if enough is ingested, lungs and the heart will shut down, leading to death. Voodoo practitioners have been able to find just the right amount of this substance to paralyze people and then turn them into zombies when they wake up. Most, however, won't get the luxury of waking up, unfortunately. But risk-taking sushi enthusiasts put their lives on the line by having this fish on their plate. Although it's considered to be a delicacy, a potent neurotoxin is released from the pufferfish's skin, liver, gonads, and intestines. Chefs in Japan require a special permit to prepare the pufferfish, but of course, accidents still happen. Number 5. Mercury. Mercury is all around us. It's in our fluorescent light bulbs, our thermometers, and even swimming in our oceans. It's also one of the most common elements that can turn cities into toxic wastelands. Look at New Idria, California, for example. The discovery of mercury here was important for gold mining, and this happened during a time when gold mining was sweeping through Northern California. The mercury is used to extract gold from gold ore, and it results in a much purer gold. It became an important mining location up until the mine was closed in 1972, and people began to realize how toxic mercury truly was. The mercury got into the people's water supply here and caused the shutdown of an entire city. Many cases of mercury poisoning are results of long-term exposure. For example, mercury is found in fish, and if you eat fish 2 times a day for 20 years, it leads to things such as reduced cognitive function, organ failure, muscle weakness, and speech impairments. This photo here shows a person experimenting with mercury, which is actually a liquid metal at room temperature. The slightest change of temperature with mercury will cause it to expand or retract, making it useful in thermometers. However, these thermometers are really dangerous and are less used. Number 4. Mustard gas. Also known as sulfur mustard, this is definitely not something you want to put on your hot dog. Mustard gas gets its nickname from the unique rotten, mustardy garlic onion smell it gives off, and is classified as a blister agent. So not only does it smell bad, but it will seriously blister your eyes and lungs. Once it's irritated your entire body's respiratory system, it then acts as a poison, attacking your body's cells. Eyes will swell, tear up, and the voice will coarsen. It's almost like pepper spray on steroids. Severe blisters are left to immobilize the intended target. This was commonly used in World War I and also in the Middle East during the Iran-Iraq War, although chemical warfare has been banned by the UN. Number 3. Ethylene glycol. Also known as antifreeze, this cheap substance can be deadlier than other poisons, not necessarily because it's more toxic, but because it has a fairly sweet taste to it, and it won't be easily detected either. It can be toxic to pets who might find the lure of the taste being irresistible, and it's unfortunately a common form of accidental pet poisoning. It's important to check for antifreeze leaks coming from your car. All it takes is less than 3 ounces of this stuff, and it can be fatal to a medium-sized dog. It's rapidly absorbed into the gastrointestinal system, which might give victims a brief feeling of drunkenness. But it quickly turns into one of those nights where you pounded down 10 shots of vodka and are feeling extremely nauseous. It will quickly lead to a brain and liver failure, and eventually, much worse. Even if someone survives ingesting this toxic substance, it's very likely they will have kidney damage, brain damage, and possibly blindness. Number 2. Bactrotoxin. Another lethal substance found in nature, this one comes straight from a poisonous frog. This lethal cocktail of deadly toxins are used in poison darts and can kill its target within a matter of seconds. The strange part about this toxin is that the frog doesn't produce this chemical itself. It comes from a part of their diet of poisonous beetles. The poison paralyzes the muscles, leaving the victims immobile but still alive, similar to tetrodotoxin. Eventually, the poison moves to the heart and triggers a heart attack. Basically, you can't go around eating random frogs or beetles, or you might get exposed to this one. At number 1, botulinum toxin. You probably have never heard of the scientific name, but I'm sure you've heard of Botox. That's right, the stuff that people are injecting into their face to look younger is in fact a neurotoxic poison. Like a lot of things on this list, too much of a good thing is a bad thing. Not trying to give anyone ideas here, but if somehow terrorists got a hold of this substance, just 1 gram of airborne Botox could kill an estimated 1 million people. While a very small amount is used in treating muscle stiffness, this neurotoxin has devastating capabilities. Links between muscles and nerves are completely cut off, leading to respiratory failure. If you can't breathe, you can't live. End of story.
All right, guys, so we just have one more PowerPoint to look at. It's a very brief one. I'm not even going to go through the whole PowerPoint because it's not necessary. I gave you guys an article to read. I posted it on Moodle a few days ago. It's on litigating climate change. It's a comparative analysis of the ways that the courts look at particular remedies that people may want to pursue in a civil action regarding climate change in both the United States and Canada. We're only really concerned about the Canadian position at this point. Where do we go here? Oh, hang on a sec, guys. Sorry. I don't know how that happened. Okay, so, all right, this is a very, very brief National Geographic video on this topic.
For 2.5 million years, the Earth's climate has fluctuated, cycling from ice ages to warmer periods. But in the last century, the planet's temperature has risen unusually fast, about 1.2 to 1.4 degrees Fahrenheit. Scientists believe it's human activity that's driving the temperatures up, a process known as global warming. Ever since the Industrial Revolution began, factories, power plants, and eventually cars have burned fossil fuels such as oil and coal, releasing huge amounts of carbon dioxide and other gases into the atmosphere. These greenhouse gases trap heat near the Earth through a naturally occurring process called the greenhouse effect. The greenhouse effect begins with the sun and the energy it radiates to the Earth. The Earth and the atmosphere absorb some of this energy, while the rest is radiated back into space. Naturally occurring gases in the atmosphere trap some of this energy and reflect it back, warming the Earth. Scientists now believe that the greenhouse effect is being intensified by the extra greenhouse gases that humans have released. Evidence for global warming includes a recent string of very warm years. Scientists report that 1998 was the warmest year in measured history, with 2005 coming in second. Meanwhile, readings taken from ice cores show that the greenhouse gases carbon dioxide and methane have hit their highest levels in the past 420,000 years. Arctic sea ice is also shrinking. According to NASA studies, the extent of Arctic sea ice has declined about 10% in the last 30 years. As long as industrialized nations consume energy and developing countries increase their fossil fuel consumption, the concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere will continue to rise. Researchers predict that temperatures will increase about 2 to 10 degrees Fahrenheit by the end of the century. What's less certain is what rising temperatures mean for the planet. Some climate models predict subtle changes. Others forecast rising sea levels which could flood coastal areas around the world. Weather patterns could change, making hurricanes more frequent. Severe droughts could become more common in warm areas, and species unable to adapt to the changing conditions would face extinction. Although much remains to be learned about global warming, many organizations advocate cutting greenhouse gas emissions to reduce the impact of global warming. Consumers can help by saving energy around the house, switching to compact fluorescent light bulbs, and driving fewer miles in the car each week. These simple changes may help keep the Earth cooler in the future.
Okay, so the point of that obviously was, and it goes back to our first video on chasing ice, is climate change and how is it approached in courts, all right? So not just regulations and statutes that governments put in place, but how do courts, handle actions that are brought by citizens who are affected by climate change and global warming. So the article I gave you, it's only a couple of years old, and what it basically says is that judges have taken, a different position in both Canada and the US on what's called the judiciability of climate change, which means the ability to have a case heard in the judicial system. That's essentially what that means. And so the elementary question is, what should courts do? How should courts approach deciding whether they are going to, in fact, intrude into an issue such as climate change, which is so incredibly broad that it may best be left to politicians to deal with, rather than courts determining liability outside of statutory regimes. All right. So judges in the U.S. take what it's called a more principled approach, while in Canada, the courts take what's called a broadly framed approach. Right. So though climate change is new, right, in that it's a phenomenon that really hasn't, generated a great deal of court activity in the course of its, its identification as something that has to be addressed. Why should courts, the question is, why should courts take any different approach to dealing with this particular issue than they would to any other new issue that's come before them over the course of time, basically, right? There's always been a contest of rights in most legal issues. So the question becomes, why should addressing climate change be any different? So in this regard, what Canadian courts have done, they've taken a two-pronged approach to assessing whether they should basically get into the arena of dealing with adjudicating issues around climate change. They first ascertain whether the question is purely political in nature and therefore should be determined outside courts of law. So if the remedy for environmental harm caused by climate change in a very broad global warming context gives rise to somebody complaining that they are being harmed by it, if that's something that courts see as a political issue more than one that is judicial in nature, then they're going to leave it with the politicians. The second approach is, that a court will in fact address issues of climate change if they believe that there is a sufficient legal component to warrant intervention by the courts, which simply means that, that whatever is being asked of by somebody who sees environmental harm as a function of climate change, is there enough, for the most part, common law development to warrant courts actually getting involved, right? So it's a very difficult question. It's one that's totally unresolved at this point. It goes back to our discussion at the beginning of this class regarding, how should that balancing act between, saving the environment and or, the factories making money and politicians recognizing both of those parts of the balancing act. Should courts get involved in that act itself for those people who believe they've been harmed? All right, so that's all we're going to do for this particular issue with climate change. So that's where we're going to call this, bring it to an end. So what we're going to do now, as we always have done, is we're going to go into the breakout room. So again, you guys know the routine. So you have 5 questions that I posted on Moodle yesterday. I'm going to break you into the 5 groups. Again, 20 minutes. That's worked really well throughout this semester. So I'll see you guys back here at the end of the session, and we'll address these questions, and then we're done. All right, guys.